This show is sponsored by idealworkspace.com, which promotes a healthier way of working through their adjustable standing desk. Check out their latest smart adjustable standing desk at altizen.com, altizen.com. Welcome to Analyse Asia, the podcast dedicated to dissect the pulse of business, technology, and media in Asia. In this episode, I speak to Jon Russell in a 2-episode arc on the major acquisitions that are shaking the Asia landscape from Southeast Asia to China. In the first part, we discuss the recent acquisition of Uber Southeast Asia by Grab and its impact to Go-Jek and Ola within the Asian landscape. Hi, John.
Hi, Bernard. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Great.
You were having a vacation during when the big event happened, right?
Yeah, it seems like this happens from time to time, right? I don't take a lot of holiday, but when I've been away, there have been a couple of big deals in Southeast Asia. So coincidence, maybe?
Or maybe they just found out that, they got your holiday schedule from TechCrunch. And then
yeah, it must be about me. It's all about me, right? But I think like a couple of years ago, Alibaba Lazada deal broke when I was away, and now the Grab Uber deal. So yeah. Fun times.
So maybe the next time you take on vacation, another big deal will happen. And my main guest today is none other than Jon Russell, reporter at TechCrunch, who broke the story for the announcement of Grab acquiring Uber Southeast Asia. I think today I'm going to get you on this time around to talk about 2 episodes at least, because I think that there's so many acquisitions that's been happening in the past week that we need to have a longer conversation. So the first thing before we start on the main subject of the day, since we last spoke, what have you been up to?
On vacation, really. No, all kinds of different things. When's the last time that we spoke? I've been on the podcast quite a few times, which I'm always happy to do. I think it's interesting to watch, you're talking about Grab Uber. I think you're giving me a bit too much credit here. I mean, a lot of the stories that were written, the first sort of leaks or scoops of the news came from outside of Southeast Asia. So I think it was interesting to see that. Obviously, it was quite clear from that the deal was being done by folks, in San Francisco or in New York, or basically not in the region. So, which I think is, I guess it's the first deal of its kind in Southeast Asia. $6 billion company merging with Uber is pretty big. And so I guess lots of elements from the deal were, what we see in this part of the world.
But we always see that this deal is actually coming given how Uber has been in such a negative downward spiral since last year after all the scandals broke out and Travis Kalanick got replaced by Dara Khosrowshahi.
Yeah, I think there were lots of rumors, right? And at a basic level, it makes sense, right? As soon as SoftBank completed its investment in Uber, it didn't really make sense for them to have 2 competing companies, and I think this market is a challenging one anyway at the moment. A lot of people have written, and there have been a lot of reports about where it's going to be in sort of the next 10 years, 5 years, but it's not really there at the moment, right? So even if you owned the entire, ride-hailing market in Southeast Asia, you're probably still not going to be profitable, let alone when you have 2 companies that are competing for it, and, they're having to compete by offering, discounts to drivers and passengers. It doesn't really make sense in that respect, right, for SoftBank to have 2 companies that are losing even more money than they would do because they're having to fight. So I guess, people outside the region, it seemed obvious, right? Especially when you consider that, Uber had left China and Russia, where the situation had been pretty similar. So yeah, but I guess people in the region, we didn't really like the idea of this, right? Because we liked the competition, and I think, there's lots of good reasons to have 2 companies. So I think most people that I talk to have been pretty anti the whole deal, right?
So we have 2-part conversation. I guess the first part really concerns Southeast Asia, and then the second part will concern Northeast Asia, mainly in China. So I think the first part I want to talk about is Grab acquiring Uber Southeast Asia. The only data point I have is that there's an equity swap of 27.5%, meaning that Uber will have 27.5% of Grab. And I don't know whether there are any cash deal involved, but let me just start off with the very first question to you. Before the deal happened, there have been rumors circulating about Uber and Grab are in talks to discuss the acquisition, similar to how the Didi deal was done. I mean, the fact that Dara actually avoided Southeast Asia and just traveled to India and Japan. What is the backstory on the circumstances that led to this deal happening? And of course, who do you think the leakers are?
I don't have all the answers here, right? I think it's pretty clear, right, that this is a deal that's being done not by people in the region, but by people outside of the region, right? So whether that's investors in Silicon Valley or SoftBank, I guess, is an obvious candidate, right, considering that they're investing in both companies. And yeah, there anecdotally, there's definitely a lot of small factors, right? For example, you mentioned the CEO came over to do an Asia tour, and he went to Japan and he went to India, but he didn't come to Southeast Asia. They had product teams in different parts of the world that were working on localizing their Uber service in certain ways, and that didn't really have a team in Southeast Asia. And just so my take on it is, obviously it's a great deal for Grab because they get two things. They get their main competitor out of the way. They're buying the Uber ride-hailing app and Uber Eats. They're closing the app apparently pretty soon, right, in the next couple of days now, and they're going to fold Uber Eats into new Grab food service. So they get to take all of the pie, so to speak. But I think also there's more than that, and I've heard that Grab is hiring for more than 1,000 people at the moment. They have 1,000 open jobs, and so they wanted to fill those with a lot of Uber people. So I think 500 odd Uber staff are planned to transition over to Grab. So I think it's two things. I mean, one obviously is to get more share in the market, but two is also to get the talent in to grow their business. And they're going into financial services, mobile payments. There's the food delivery service. So they really need to scale their business too. So I think it's a twofold deal. And I think that's the reason why Uber has got such an attractive exit deal, right? Because when you read it in the press, Uber has beaten Grab, slayed Uber, all these kind of things you hear. It's not actually, it's true that Grab won, right? They were the biggest player, but Uber's obviously got something that Grab wants if they can still get a deal where they get, 27.5% of a $6 billion company. That's not a bad exit, right? And obviously that share is likely to grow as well as Grab moves into other areas like food delivery and financial services. So I think, it's not like that Grab won and Uber lost. It's like, Uber decided at some point that Grab was just a bit too powerful in Southeast Asia. And I guess they looked at where the market is at this point, and they figured they could optimize the money that they would spend in Southeast Asia much, much better if they spent it either in the US or India or other parts of the world. So I think it was a bit more than just, one of them wins and one of them loses, which I think a lot of media have gone to town on. Grab is the Uber slayer of Southeast Asia or whatever you will, right?
Well, that's the part that is the heroic story for Grab. The fundamental question I also want to ask is that, was it just only an equity swap deal, or are there also cash involved where Grab has to pay something to Uber in order to do the acquisition?
Yeah, so there's nothing that's been disclosed. I've heard some sort of rumors that there was some money that changed hands, under $100 million US, and that was just for cleaning some pieces up, operationally, because I think that the transition of talent is going to take some time, right? It's not like, you work for Uber on Monday and then on Tuesday you work for Grab. I think that moving that many people across is always going to take some time. So I think there was some cash that changed hands, but considering that the stake that Uber's taken is worth 1.6 billion, I think the actual cash part of it is pretty tiny, really. So maybe you know more. I don't know. Do you know more than me about this? Probably.
Well, I did have a couple of people who are my sources and who are also investors to both companies who I shall not name. And I did know the number that Grab wanted was 27%. And kind of the week before the deal broke out, I actually reviewed it to one of my friends who is a regular listener on the show. And I told him the deal should close around 27%, but it closed at 27.5, which I kind of got it right.
Nice. You should have told me. I was on holiday, but anyway.
No, now the tables are turned too, right? But part that I didn't get was the cash piece. And I think that all the while, the few I've been getting from the investors, it was going to be a pure equity swap deal. And they tried to minimize the amount of cash transfer between both companies. I think that was one of the key parts on this deal that makes it so interesting.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it's like a truce, right? There's no need to exchange cash when, you're giving people on one hand, Uber is getting a pretty good stake in a company that is, bound to grow, right? Grab is getting, as I mentioned, is getting more access to the market because they're knocking out their biggest competitor. And then obviously they're getting that talent, which they really do need, right? They've had to open up offices, in Seattle and in India, to get extra talent because there's just a limited number of people who are here in Southeast Asia that can be part of their team. So I think that is actually an underreported and a very important piece of the deal.
So there lies the question then, who are the winners and losers for Grab and Uber Southeast Asia deal? The way I'm going to do it is I'm going to give 5 different groups of stakeholders, and then you tell me
under pressure now. Okay.
Okay,
shoot.
Let's start off with Grab first.
win, obviously, right? They get more access, they get less competition in the market, and they get more talent coming over to fill those 1,000 vacant jobs that they've got at the moment.
Uber Southeast Asia?
Uber is also a win. Maybe not as much of a win as Grab, but they still win because they've got a very decent chunk of a company that is only going to grow, and they don't have the operational uncertainty of being in Southeast Asia where they were losing cash.
I'll be curious to know what's Didi's stake in Grab, because if Uber and Didi does go into war, they might both try to consolidate Grab under them. I think that is also one question that's very interesting to me as well.
I don't know. I mean, perhaps you know, but I don't know.
Well, I'm just listening and just understanding the market better. I think a lot of listeners and audience out there probably would just hear about Grab and Uber Southeast Asia, but they forgot that there is a very big competitor to Grab, but only currently in Indonesia, which is called Go-Jek. And Go-Jek have raised about 1.2 billion round from a couple of investors, Google, Tencent, and a couple of big investors as well. So the question is, for Go-Jek, will they be winner or loser? Because I did wrote a newsletter article about considering the potential pitch that Go-Jek might make a play for Uber Southeast Asia assets.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, right? I don't think anyone has the answer. I mean, talking to people at Go-Jek, they're pretty confident, right? They are quite happy that Uber is out of the equation. It makes it easier to just fight with one other person. And there's all this talent that is supposedly going over to Grab, but I don't doubt that Go-Jek will probably, cherry pick certain people who they think can add value to their company too, right? Especially now, it's pretty public, but they're, looking to move into a few different countries very soon. And I think so Vietnam is one, Thailand is another, and the Philippines is a third, and Singapore also too. So obviously they'd be looking for the kind of people that Uber had, or the guys that set the company up in Southeast Asia in the first place. And it very much, that role that Go-Jek would be looking to fill is more aligned, I would say, with what Uber Southeast Asia staff have done than it is with those guys going over to Grab, right? If you were one of the launchers, one of the first sort of 10 or 20 people in Uber Southeast Asia, then you'd probably think, yeah, actually, I prefer to be at Go-Jek than a big company like Grab. So I think it's interesting. Who knows, right? Who knows? But it's definitely not easy. I mean, as a brand, sure, they're big in Indonesia, but they don't have any brand in any other country in Southeast Asia. So I think it's going to be quite tough, and they got to start again in 4 different countries. But I mean, it's going to be great. I'm excited. I mean, everybody outside of the region just assumes that once Uber leaves, Grab is going to dominate that country. And I think, as we're seeing in the Chinese market too, there are other players that are also thinking that there's a good opportunity to come in even after Uber's gone.
And I think that the interesting point is that Indonesia market is the largest market in Southeast Asia. So there's also this question that many people like myself have, is that can any company from Singapore or Malaysia expand into Southeast Asia and take out the market? Because there may be local sentiments involved. There may be nationalist tendencies as well, as we have observed in the Chinese market.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Like Indonesia, as you say, is the 4th largest country for population, and, the largest economy in Southeast Asia. So it's obviously huge. But, I think there'd been a question before as to whether Go-Jek, which is very much the leading player in Indonesia, whether they would go overseas at all. And it seems like the timing of the Uber Grab deal has worked out pretty good for them, right? Because now they have a much better chance, I think anyway, of competing. Whereas if there were 3 of them, 3 doesn't really work as well as 2.
Well, of course, there's the drama that both CEOs are former classmates in the same Harvard Business School class. So there's also something to talk about. But what about the employees at Uber Southeast Asia? Do you think that they're the losers of this whole deal?
I think it's tough, right? There's so many different... So that 500 people who are moving over, they're from all kinds of different countries, all kinds of different roles inside the company. I don't doubt that a lot of them probably don't want to go over to Grab. It would be weird, right? If you're competing with a company for so long, and then one day you're like, oh, I have to go and join that company. Maybe the role isn't quite the same within Grab. I think Grab probably is a bigger organization in Southeast Asia than Uber is. So no doubt there will be a lot of them who sort of don't fancy it. I guess there'll be others that do. I mean, I can't speak for 500 people, right? But I do think the more senior guys who sort of run countries or run divisions within Uber Southeast Asia, I think they would be looking to a Go-Jek or potentially other companies too, perhaps.
I heard the non-compete clauses for the employees at Uber Southeast Asia joining Grab aren't that favorable, right?
Yeah, so I'm actually doing some research on at the moment, but I'll just say that it seems at this point like the Southeast Asia deal for Uber staff is a bit different to how it has been in other places. So in China and in Russia. So obviously China, they sold to Didi, and then Didi kept the Uber app going. And so there was a need for like operational people to stay on for Uber China. Russia, they did a joint venture with Yandex, like the biggest internet company there, which has a ride-sharing company. The Uber app continued to run for another 6 months. So again, they needed their staff to be there for that. Grab, when they announced the deal, they said they're closing their Uber app in 2 weeks, right? So that's a much different, do they need staff for longer than 2 weeks? I think that they're trying their best, having talked to both companies, but I think it's just a very difficult thing to manage, right? Like 500 people moving over to another company is quite a tough thing to do, yeah. But I mean, I would agree with you that I personally think that like some of the terms do seem a bit forced. I don't think that you can make somebody join another company. And it looks like there are some clauses within, the sort of transition where to some extent, like the Uber employees, their immediate future is in the hands of Grab. So whether Grab makes them an offer or not, and whether they accept it or don't, that impacts the compensation that they get from Uber. And I guess that's a part of the deal that they've negotiated because they want to keep that talent inside Grab. But certainly I can understand if some of them are a bit sort of upset that they've been abandoned by Uber.
I think the last group of people, which I totally don't want to forget, is consumers like you and me in Southeast Asia. Are we the losers of this deal?
Well, I think it's early to say, right? And I know Grab has gone on a big PR offensive to say that they're not going to change their prices and, they're going to keep everything as it stands. I guess, from an antitrust perspective, that's kind of important to put that message out there. I mean, I don't really blame anybody for being upset about this because there's something that's reassuring about having two companies that are competing somewhere. And even if Grab does keep its prices, you can understand consumers not really being, Grab has to earn that trust by actually walking the walk on prices. They can't expect to just say, oh, we're going to keep the prices the same and everyone to say, oh, okay, that's absolutely fine. I mean, as we're seeing, with Facebook and others, people are beginning to, have a level of distrust for tech companies. And so I think Grab may be upset that people are not trusting it, but they have to earn that really, right? I mean, personally, I don't use ride-hailing apps all that much, more than like a couple of times per week. But definitely like as a consumer, it doesn't feel good, right? And that explains why, Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia, and probably others are looking into that deal pretty closely, right?
There's deeper implications to the deal happening. One is, what does that mean for ride-hailing in Southeast Asia? Given that Grab has everything else except Indonesia, will they eventually surround them and basically beat them in Indonesia then? I think these are the two things sort of comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, it's quite funny. It seems like Grab is positioning itself or arguing that you shouldn't really look at its position in the market just on the apps, right? I think their numbers, they own like 60% of the ride-hailing business or the ride-hailing revenue or rides or whatever you like across Southeast Asia. But it seems like they're positioning their market share on a more sort of broad focus, which is that like, oh, you can also hail a taxi without the apps, right? So when they were pushing media about how successful that they were very much playing up the ownership of the app, based hailing market. And now that all these governments are looking into the deal, they're sort of talking about it more broadly as point to point, right? Which also includes like, on-street hailing, SMS hailing. And I guess that's because they don't want to be too dominant of this deal. So it depends whether you look at it on a, strictly on a basis of people hailing rides via an app, or whether you look at it as an overall sort of a taxi industry basis.
I think the next question is probably really is a strategic question. Do you see the domino for Uber to also collapse in India with Ola taking over Uber's assets in India, given that SoftBank also owns Ola and Uber now?
Yeah, I mean, it seems pretty clear, right, that there have been conversations. Anecdotally, I've heard that, and there's been lots of coverage in the press about those two companies, meeting together and talking. Uber's CEO's come out and said this deal with Grab is the last time they're going to be exiting a region. That probably, I mean, that's not saying that he won't do any more deals, right? It just means that they're not going to be the minority anymore. So I guess that means that if they're pushing for a deal with Ola, they want to buy Ola, right?
I mean, if they lose India, Uber is just basically a regional power. Basically, they only have Europe, US and the European markets. There's really no value for them to grow.
it's really hard to know who's winning each market, like what the market share is. But the sort of anecdotal evidence that you hear from India is that actually Uber is doing pretty good. So Uber doesn't cover as much of the country as Ola does, but those markets that it does cover, those cities it does cover, it competes pretty fairly, if not above. And I think that was the same in Southeast Asia for a long time. And then it just seemed like, 2017, maybe there was all this crisis happening inside the company, and they just sort of took their eye off the ball and just didn't invest the same as they'd been doing in Southeast Asia, which is why I think personally that Grab got ahead. But it seems like in India, they're a bit more focused. They have an India president. There's a bit more autonomy there. And I guess that has probably helped them at least stay at the same level as Ola, if not perhaps ahead. So I guess that would give them a better shot at buying out the other company rather than, as was the case in Southeast Asia, and China being the one that's bought out. That would be my guess for what happens, right? Is that they're pushing Ola they want to be the dominant one that buys the other one. And probably Ola thinks that it should be the other way around. So I guess the challenge now for those two is who wins that one. And I'd imagine, again, like this is just based on what I think, not from any knowledge I have, but that, SoftBank would be keen to broker that deal. And now it's between those two to prove which is the one that is the buyer and which one is the one that is going to be the seller.
The question would be SoftBank, will they still play a role in making sure that all their assets are playing nice to each other?
I don't think they care about who's playing nice. They just care about what's the best solution for them, right? Like I've heard of other deals where they've walked into a deal and they've made all these demands that maybe even the founders don't actually like, but because of the power that they have, they've got the deal done in the way that they want. So I don't think that they really care about, well, I don't know that they don't care, but they obviously prioritize their own goals above everyone else's.
I think the last question for me, just before we close this, would be the Competition Commission of Singapore has said that it has reasonable grounds to suspect the merger of Grab and Uber Southeast Asia has infringed the Competition Act and also triggered the similar conversations in Malaysia and Philippines governments to look into the deal. The question would be, is there a possibility that the deal gets defrayed or maybe some other unintended consequences might happen because of this?
Yeah, well, you give me all the really tough ones today, right? I mean, so you're asking me, is the deal going to go through or not? I mean, so I personally think that the deal can go through because, as I said, like I don't actually use ride-hailing apps all that much. I sometimes take street taxis, so I can understand personally that there's another way to get taxis without, using my phone. But other people don't think like that. And other people will only book taxis if they book it from their phone. So I think it depends on your own personal take. And I think it's an impossible one to call. I mean, I imagine that it's such a big deal. And I think the fact that it's Grab that's buying Uber and not the other way around is ultimately a reason that is going to go through. I think if it was Uber buying up Grab, I think the regulator framework and the approach that they'd be taking, you might see a bit more concern. But I mean, what can they even do there? I don't get. I mean, maybe you can help me here. What happens if the commission says that this deal is not a legal deal? They unwind the deal in full, or in some countries? I mean, it's not very clear, right?
That's right. But I mean, unlike the US, which have very clear laws, if a deal is being defrayed, then what will happen is that there's actually a breakup fee that would have to happen. For example, Broadcom was unable to acquire Qualcomm and they have to pay $3 billion for a breakup fee because the deal didn't went through. So I think in the Singapore situation where M&A deals are pretty much more fluid, there might be a structural issue. It will also challenge the way how competition commissions in the region thinking about this.
I guess the hard part is these are two companies that are in 8 different countries in Southeast Asia. The impact is beyond Singapore only. I mean, I'm not sure what would happen, whether they could wind back the deal so that in Singapore Uber was still going and Grab was, if they thought that was the right thing to do, or whether it will be all 8 countries. Or I mean, to me, it just seems too complicated, right? And I also do think that there's a broader thing here that you can also in Singapore you can book taxis in the dedicated taxi apps, right? So Comfort has its own app and others do too, right? So there is an argument that there is a bit more competition, but definitely in terms of your sort of smartphone hailing apps, you would say that they have a very dominant position by buying out Uber.
I thought I should just have to add this because last year I was being invited to speak in a competition law conference in Singapore, but actually dealing with a global competition commissions. And one interesting question that does come out is that the moment when both companies merge, you actually get the data of the customers. And in this case, Grab has actually got the entire database of Uber Southeast Asia users. So the question is that might actually strengthen the ways that they can do business much more, giving them more advantage over maybe the taxi companies. I think these are questions that they have to deal with. I guess the government will have to figure it out in one way or another.
Complicated, huh? Very complicated. It's like, I mean, all of these rumors about this deal happening, it had been like weeks and weeks and months. And then you think, okay, now that's done. And actually there's a whole lot more that's going on, right? The talent being transferred, and then there's this regulation angle. It's probably going to go on for a few months, right?
Yeah, but I think it's something that's worth watching, and probably we should just take a break and come back for the second part, which is much more interesting.
Okie dokie.